Hello, I'm sure you're not expecting me, but I'm actually the founder and former coordinator of the Oxford Women's Festival that first started putting on the Dorothy Hodgkin talks in about 1999, so a long time ago. And it's always been part of the festival. And today it seems very apt as well because it's International Women's Day, which now, compared with when I started doing the festival, is now being celebrated by so many different organisations. It's just wonderful, creative, scientific, all kinds of institutions. It's also part of having this is part of the festival, was to celebrate science. We're very good, at least the city is, very good at celebrating the arts, but the science is actually sometimes more difficult. So it's a bridge between science and women, and it's also meant to be a bridge between the city, which I feel I represent, and my colleagues, and the university through Somerville. And it's really wonderful that Somerville is hosting it, so I'd like to thank them for doing that. And I will now hand over to the principal. Oh. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and a very warm welcome to Somerville. It is, of course, International Women's Day, as has been said, and we've got a wonderful thing to celebrate today. So we have an extraordinary woman in our midst called Pat Outram, who is 100 years old. She's a Somervillian, of course. She was a Bletchley code breaker. She then went on to be a BBC producer and championed and started programmes like The Sky at Night and University Challenge. And you know, she's the only woman in Chiswick to know how to use a Sten gun. Hey! But most importantly, yesterday our governing body elected Pat as an honorary fellow of this college. So please, a round of applause. There she is, the extraordinary Pat Outram. Well, now you are. How good is that? So, together with the Oxford Association for Women in Science and Engineering, I'm delighted to welcome so many people to this celebration of women in science. This year's Dorothy Hodgkin Memorial Lecture is more special than usual. It is 60 years since she was awarded the Nobel Prize for Chemistry, still the only British woman to have received such a Nobel Prize, which is really quite shaming, is it not? I hope that you've seen the medal, which is usually kept in the Ashmolean, in the medal collection, but today we have it here so you can see it. It's really very special, together with her gown and some amazing photographs, including one which actually it's part of GB Minutes, and it cites the reason why she was given medical leave in order to have her baby. She's the first woman in Oxford to have had what was in essence maternity leave, so that is incredible. Liz Hodgkin, where are you, Liz? Liz is there. Liz is Dorothy's daughter. So a very warm welcome to you. And we have some of Dorothy's former chemistry students and also other students who were here when she was lecturing, but who did not study chemistry, but were very aware of her presence in the college. We're so proud to be the College of Dorothy Hodgkin, and as I never tire of saying, for those of you who've been here before, I cannot get over the fact that when she was awarded this medal, this global recognition, the local Oxford Mail said, "Oxford housewife wins medal." As I said, it was her belief that women with families should not be impeded in their careers. So not only did she fight for maternity leave, she also used the prize money from the Nobel to set up our nursery, which is still going, because she believed that women should be able to work and have children, to do their research and have children. In fact, we just finished a wonderful crowdfunder in her name, and all the tiny tots know about Dorothy Hodgkin, which is really rather wonderful. So Dorothy was a brilliant academic, an unparalleled problem solver whose work came to revolutionise our understanding of antibiotics, diabetes, and so much more. Whilst her greatest legacy was her extraordinary scientific research, to which we owe so much, I love her tangible understanding of the needs of women scientists. She was a great human being. On this special occasion, it is fitting that we have another superb scientist, a biochemist, and an amazing human being to deliver the Dorothy Hodgkin Memorial Lecture. It was such a pleasure and an honour when our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Irene Tracey, accepted our invitation to give the lecture. She has received countless awards and honours, including the MRC Suffrage Science Life Sciences Award, which was first awarded to a Somervillian called Louise Johnson, but then in turn it came down to you, Irene. And tonight we've got the most recent recipient of that award here. I've lost her. She's not a Somervillian, unfortunately, but hey, that's wonderful. Congratulations. Irene has Oxford running through her like a stick of rock. She was born just next door in the JR, went to school here, did biochemistry as an undergraduate and postgraduate at Merton, then went to Harvard as medical school as a postdoc. It was there that she became interested in pain, and she returned to Oxford in 1997, where she helped to found the Oxford Centre for Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging of the Brain, which was later renamed the Wellcome Centre for Integrative Neuroimaging, and she served as its director from 2005 to 2015. In 2016, she became the head of the Nuffield Department of Neurosciences, and at various times she was a fellow of Christchurch and a fellow of Pembroke, then installed as warden of Merton. However, happily for this university, she became our Vice-Chancellor at the beginning of 2023, and she is doing the most fantastic job. She's providing leadership for our university, but also for the wider higher education sector. She understands the complexities of this crazy collegiate system, the needs of academics, colleges, departments, divisions, but also the needs of our city, our country, and the world. She's passionate about research, the way in which it can and must be used to solve the challenges of the world. And she understands the role and responsibility of our university. I think this evening we're going to hear some more about her own research as she delivers the lecture entitled Seeing Pain, a Window on the Human Brain Through Neuroimaging. Irene, it's such a pleasure. Over to you.
Thank you, Jan. That was an overly generous introduction, but thank you so much for that. You can see I've already changed the title, but it's the same sort of area. I am absolutely thrilled to be here. I was enormously touched, and I feel very privileged to be giving this lecture on such a special anniversary. Liz, your mum is one of my absolute heroines. You cannot be a woman scientist without having Dorothy as your idol. And so when Jan reached out to me, it was a no-brainer, if you forgive the pun, that I would absolutely love to come and join you all. You can see I've come in uniform. I was tipped off, the black and the red. So I'm in the team colours here tonight, even though I am a Mertonian through and through. Forgive me. Anyway, it's wonderful to be here, and I can see lots of different people that I know from different walks of life that I've had largely here in Oxford. So thank you all for coming and being willing to listen to a little bit of pain. I'm always suspicious of an audience that turns up in such large volumes to listen about pain, and no doubt we'll get into some of that, your aches and pains, in the Q&A later. I'm going to sort of do a romp through a little bit about the history of the brain and how we have ended up developing these imaging tools, and focus obviously on the role that Oxford has played in that journey. And then the sort of second half of my talk will be focusing on my own personal research, which has been to try and understand this really complex thing called pain, and then some of the parallel work we've done trying to understand how anaesthetics produced altered states of perceptual awareness or consciousness. So before I begin on that side, I just want to start, as it is International Women's Day, to of course give credit not just to the amazing Dorothy Hodgkin, but to the woman before her and the whole family, as we tend to think of in science. You have these generations of families that you foster and that you mentor. And so I think in the context of course, Dorothy's rightly deserved Nobel Prize for her work in crystallography, for those of you who are not too familiar with the technology, it all started with really these two gentlemen, father and son team, Braggs, and William Braggs, who's the elder of them. He was a great champion of women. And in fact, out of his 18 research students, 11 were women. That was remarkable at that time. And for those who know what William Braggs did, he's a physicist. He worked on trying to understand the patterns that would occur if you shone X-rays through crystals. And he realised that rather than the physics that was being applied for, which had other sort of applications, the dots that were produced could actually probably tell you something really interesting about the atomic structure of these molecules. And using extraordinary equipment, I always love going and seeing all the old bits of kit and gear that scientists back in the day had to use. We've got all these fancy machines now at our disposal, but with pretty elementary bits of kit was able to really do those very first experiments. Indeed, he got the Nobel Prize as well for that, to sort of decode the fundamental reading and move the understanding of crystal structures that were very interesting in their own right. So snowflakes would be one, and other ways that you've experienced crystals, salt crystals you probably made as a child, to then take it to the next level, which is to say within that crystal, if you shine X-rays through and decode the pattern correctly using clever maths, you can work out actually the molecular structure. So it took X-ray crystallography into the molecular realm. And one of his students, Kathleen Lonsdale, who in fact was one of the first women to be admitted to the Royal Society, a brilliant woman in her own right, would make out of food tins the sort of first, if sort of spin outs and innovation was around, she would have spun out a company to make the commercialization of this food can, which was her sort of first commercial sort of product of an X-ray camera. And she was the supervisor of Dorothy. And so this lovely line continues, and I thought it would be just nice to show you that. Liz, I'm thrilled you're here because this is supposedly, I've been told, the telegram that was sent to you to tell you that your mother had got the Nobel Prize in chemistry. And because they wanted to be economical and fiduciary responsible, very few words were used. It just says, Dorothy, Nobel chemistry. And that was it. And that was sent to you. I think you were in Ghana, you were in somewhere in Africa at the time. It was, anyway, posted there. And of course, these beautiful structures, penicillin, vitamin B12 and insulin. I was giving my last lecture of the academic year to the medics the other day over in the physiology department. And of course, opposite the physiology department is where I grew up as a scientist, and that is the biochemistry department, which of course you now know is being rightly named after this extraordinary woman. And so I couldn't resist but take a few photos of myself outside there the other day. And this is a building that is just magnificent. The old biochemistry building was pretty cruddy, so we demolished that and put up this new one. And I believe Elspeth is in the audience, and she was the person that officially, there she is, opened the new Dorothy Hodgkin building, and it's just an extraordinary space, and proudly has the name of this amazing woman on its door. And of course we all know this postcard, which is a beautiful, I think, illustration of just the absolute intense concentration in trying to understand something complex and the madness of the scientist sort of office and lab. And I think it captures an awful lot about the spirit of science, but obviously the spirit of this extraordinary woman. So thinking about the human brain, well, this is where I've spent most of my life, is trying to sort of unravel the mystery of this. And I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page when we think about the brain. Here it is. It all sits up here, obviously. We have things that are called neurons, and they're the bits that do the computation. And then we have white matter connections that help the conversations happen between those different neurons in different parts of the brain, so you can send information around. And when the neurons talk to each other, they talk to each other through a thing called a synapse. It's an extraordinary organ. It only weighs in the adult brain about 1.4 kilograms. You've got about 100 billion neurons in there, and you've got more than 100 billion glial cells. Glial is the Latin word for glue, and that's what we thought they were for. They were just there as a support glue matrix to hold on and look after those neurons. We now know that those glial cells actually are incredibly important and do all sorts of interesting things in controlling blood flow, to feed the neurons, to contribute to many other problems of the brain, and so in terms of the different disorders that sadly affect our brains as we get older. So the glial cells we now know are not just a glue support structure, they are a really critical part of how the brain is not just working in its healthy state, but also contributing in many ways yet still, I think, to be discovered. Those synapses and connections, you've just got loads and loads of them. And of course, it changes as you're born all the way through to adulthood. So you have this extraordinary explosion of neuronal growth. Sadly, as you get older, it starts to collapse a little bit. But we can come on to how you can keep that robust. Probably the best way to put it into context is that it's got about the same number of stars as in the Milky Way. And you've got that all sitting in between your ears. It's extraordinary, isn't it? Absolutely extraordinary. And as I said, it develops. So these are beautiful 3D printed plastic versions of what the human brain looks like straight after birth, on the left-hand side, as an adolescent, and then as an adult, around 22. So you can see, it grows. I didn't dare put one on, knowing the demographic that might turn up as to what happens at 80, but you all look very robust to me. And of course, you're in a very neurally enriching environment at Somerville, so you're good. But you can see, two things largely happen. One, it grows, and two, it folds. And that's when all the sort of sculpting and shaping neuronal connections happen. And some of the really interesting work that's going on at the moment that we'll touch on at the end of my talk is just how much on that journey from birth to adulthood, your life's journey, the bumps and scrapes, the stresses, the strains, the nutrition, the physical activity, the educational opportunities, physical activity, all these things mark how that brain is going to be sculpted and shaped, and will confer a vulnerability or resilience in terms of how then other things that will happen in your adult life might equip you or not equip you so well to deal with. And we're just at the starting point of that journey, because we've got the tools and the large data collection schemes to now start to explore that. And that's going to be a very exciting phase for the neuroscientists that are working in this space. Now, for those of you who are sort of more in the family stage still of life, and you've got pesky teenagers at home who are being wild and reckless, well, let me just help you understand where they're at in their brains. So we're looking at this sort of brain here, and they're doing all sorts of risky things, because basically at a biological level, we haven't evolved as quickly as society has evolved. And therefore, there's a mismatch between us as animals and the capacity for us to evolve compared to the speed at which society and the globalization of the world has taken hold. And you get these mismatches. So when we look at particular regions of the brain, so prefrontal just means at the front, and limbic is very old brain, so very shared across the sort of animal world. You can see that as you go through and grow up, you will have a developmental phase that's not the same for all regions. And some regions will take a little bit longer to develop, which means your old animal brain, if you like, basic impulses as animals, programmed to, keep warm, find a mate, eat, basically, and seek things that are nice and avoid things that are not nice. And so you've got a mismatch in this adolescent phase of having a brain that the part of the brain that we now know is very involved in controlling impulses, decision making, higher order, is not catching up as quickly as your limbic brain that's going into overdrive in adolescence. So of course they're programmed to go off and be very risk-taking, because they're programmed to go and find a mate and reproduce. And that's why you get this sort of risky behaviour of adolescence and drives you crazy. And then they calm down once it sort of gets to 17, 18. That's the theory based on the anatomy. Of course, there's probably lots of other explanations to that. But it's proven some really interesting cases. Colleagues that work in the States, listed here, have gone into courts of law in America and argued against not prosecuting adolescents who maybe have gone joyriding or done things that are, again, technically illegal, on the basis that they couldn't help it because their brains were just sort of all over the shop. Now, I think that's probably going too far, but it begs the question in terms of, again, sort of ownership of your own agency and how we think about neuroscience, and as we learn more about the brain and neuroscience, how that needs to inform, again, decision making around courts of law and other aspects that actually relate very much to my field in the context of pain as well. Is there's really interesting conversations that I've had for many, many years now with the legal system, not in terms of expert witness stuff, I don't do that, but just educational combinations where we get together with lawyers who have a legal system that's very built on a rational brain and a very punitive system. But human behaviour, you're not driven by really the fear of things happening in a negative way to you. You're actually more driven behaviourally on positive things and nice things. So in fact, you've got a system that's fundamentally built on a model that is not quite right in terms of trying to motivate different types of human behaviour. Your brains make decisions emotionally, very rarely rationally. So again, you make assumptions about how the brain is programmed to work. And these are great conversations because these communities need to keep learning from each other. And again, thinking about how the systems that you set up might need to be refreshed and altered. Now, a remarkable individual, if we go back to Hippocrates, back into 400 BC, even before, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before we were really sure the brain was where thought arose and your ability to perceive things was controlled, he actually put the brain at the centre of the body in terms of where you would have complex experiences like sorrow, like pain, like grief. And that was extraordinary. I mean, he was extraordinary in so many different ways. And the reason I share that with you is because the journey afterwards sort of took us all over the place in terms of trying to understand where the seat of reason was and the seat of perception and the seat of emotions. So if we go back to some of these very early pictures that trying to understand the human brain, the very common model that went all the way to Leonardo da Vinci, had these beautiful wax cast and drawings, was that inside your head you have these large, what we call ventricles or gaps. And in those gaps, they're filled with fluid. And it sort of made sense that you would have, you've got the eyes. So we pretty much figured, okay, something must, obviously vision and sight is going to come in from the eyes. And it would come through these ventricles, through the liquid in there, and be passed on to the middle. And that would be where reason is. And then it would go back into thinking what you're going to do with it. And then you put in the memory system at the back. And you can go back to these really ancient pictures and you can see this sort of segmentation of the brain in this way. And all of the neurons and the glial were just there as a shock absorber. They were there to protect the all-important ventricles that were doing the job. And that persisted. You've got this lovely, you probably can't see it for those in this front row, but down here on the left, you've got these wax casts, which Leonardo da Vinci did, beautiful wax cast of the ventricles, because they were the really important things, these gaps inside the brain. And you can go and look at quotes from Shakespeare, tell me where is fancy bread, in the heart or in the head. So even in the 1600s, we were still, in the 1596, we were still not sure where does all this occur. And the heart was very attractive. It's in the middle of the body. It's nice and central. It's got all these things that connect out through the vessels, through the rest, and so it can communicate with all parts of your skin. I mean, if you're, back in the day, that would be a very logical place, you would think, to be the thing that was communicating with your body and able to then probably be where reason was and thinking and the ability to sense things. So this struggled on. We come to Descartes, who, again, the philosophers in the audience will know extremely well. And what he did for the medical and the science world was to very cleverly split the mind and the body. And that allowed people to feel comfortable, particularly the church to be comfortable, that us scientists could go into the lab and start chopping up bits of brain and work out what was going on, because it was felt if you go anywhere near the human brain, this is really bad, this is stepping on the footprints of God, you must not go there. So he said, well, hold on a minute, there's the physical body and then there's the mind, and that's where the sort of God bit is and the spirit is. So how about we just look at the physical body and then we won't touch the mind? It's like, excellent, off you go. It's a brilliant trick, allowed us to go in and start to do all the anatomy. Problem is that dualistic thinking and that mind-body split still is very prevalent in probably a very negative way still in this space, in that people tend to think of it as in the mind, it's not real, it's not physiology, it doesn't play out. Somehow it's the person's fault. There's lots of problems with that dualistic thinking, and I'm not going to get into the philosopher because I can see Nora O'Neill right in the audience here, and a marvellous philosopher. But there is something really interesting about the mind-body split that we still have, and it does, I still think, lead to a lot of biases in mental health disorders and the treatment of them. So that's just an aside. But anyway, the good thing is he allowed this ability for us to start to look at it. And of course, we have a great contribution here in Oxford because of the work that was done, basically taking hanged criminals from Abingdon who would be brought on carts along Dead Man's Walk behind Merton College, and they would be taken to what is now the Chiang Mai restaurant here, and they would have their, this is it back in the day. Actually, to be honest, the dates don't match. It's a great story, and it's a lovely apocryphal story, and I'm always a bit, ooh, when I'm having my pad thai there. But supposedly, anyway, the wonderful Thomas Willis, who was our Sedleyan Professor of Natural Philosophy, working with Christopher Wren and these beautiful drawings, would take these bodies, trundle them along to the Chiang Mai restaurant and chop them all up and produce this extraordinary set of books, The Anatomy of the Brain, which sits in St John's Library if you want to see them. And they are just absolutely beautiful, beautiful drawings and pictures of the human brain and giving us that first anatomical understanding. And one of the things that Thomas Willis discovered is this very famous thing called the Circle of Willis. And it's this beautiful system of blood vessels just here that really allows for redundancy. So if one bit is blocked or damaged, or there's in effect a stroke there, there's an ability for the blood to flow around the other way and still feed. So it's a really great sort of redundancy system. I just thought I'd show you one of the ones that's the modern version imaging of that, which our physicists generated here. So again, the quality of what you can get these days is with brain imaging. So we were able to do this sort of, beautiful anatomy, but we were still far away from learning, and we're now fast tracking to the 1800s. So this is even more remarkable when I've just told you 400 BC, Hippocrates said probably the brain is where it's at. We're now in the 1700s, and led by a Viennese physician called Franz Joseph Gall, who you might have heard of and you've seen probably in some of those souvenir shops, those lovely china heads with different bits of labelling on about the brain. Well, this is all what we call phrenology, and I call it the era of folly because what he noted, and this is where you've got to be really careful about correlations and causality, was that over dinner parties he would notice that a number of acquaintances with particularly good memories also had big protruding eyes. So he was forced to the idea that eyes so formed are the mark of an excellent memory. And why should not other faculties be reflected in other ways of the shape of the skull? And in terms of the external visible manifestation of that. So why don't we start now segmenting the skull into different lumps and bumps? Let's start to develop all sorts of clever contraptions that would measure this extremely well. And let's really, with great accuracy, keep trying to measure and identify something that was fundamentally completely wrong. And I think it's a great lesson when I teach the students about just how easy you can be in a trap. And we'll look back at stuff that I've discovered and we've all discovered in this point and think, why on earth did they think it worked like that? And I hope it'll be a long time and I'll be long dead by the time they do that. But it's easy to laugh now, but at the time, it was absolutely the model, and more sophisticated ways of measuring the wrong thing carried on. And in fact, the Phrenology Society of London didn't disband until the 1920s. It went on that long. So we fast forward to a chap called Phineas Gage, and he was an American man who was working on the railroads in America, and they would be blowing up parts with very dangerous explosives, and often there'd be accidents. And the particular accident that happened to him was a rod went straight through his eye and took out part of the front of his brain. I've mentioned before that the front of the brain is really important for decision making, impulse control, etc. And as his friend said, he was no longer Gage. He became very impulsive. His personality changed. He became a real problem character, having been a really wonderful man. And that was really the first awakening that, the fluffy bits that's protecting the ventricles, they're probably quite important, and they probably underpin what makes people who they are. Even complex things like your personality is expressed in the brain. And I think it's just extraordinary that, we're in the 1800s and this is when we're still working this out. So we go fast forward. I'm obviously giving you a very quick tour in 1,000 years. Wilder Penfield, a fantastic Canadian neurosurgeon, he then, in the days when you could do this sort of thing without ethics approval, would be operating on people's brains. Apologies if people find that picture unpleasant. And he would go in and start poking about. Now, the reason he could do that is, weirdly, the human brain, actually inside the brain, doesn't have any pain receptors. So obviously to get to this point, it's going to hurt. So the patients are anaesthetised in order to drill and take the skull off. And then once all that's off, which has got lots of pain fibres, and you've actually got the exposed brain, you can actually poke around inside and it's not painful. So the patient can be awake, and they can both be stimulating and saying, if you're going to cut out a bit of epileptic brain seizing area, you don't want to cut out a bit that maybe is really important for their language. So quite often they'd get the person to speak or say some words to make sure that they were not chopping out the bit that was really useful for them and chopping out just the bad bit. But then whilst in there, why not have a go and start poking around other things, which is exactly what he did. As I say, you wouldn't be able to do it these days. So he was poking around and would, both evoke, and then he would stimulate, say, parts of the body. And he did all sorts of really fantastic things in terms of Penfield's, what we call homunculus, where he mapped the sensory cortex and showed that big bits of the cortex were responsible for small bits of you, where you've got really fine resolution. You've got sensitivity, haven't you, in your tongue and your fingertips. So big bits of a particular part of the brain that's involved in touch is given over to that. But then a tiny little bit of the brain in the same strip would be for areas that you don't need much sensitivity, like your trunk. So he's got this little man that's really weird, big lips, big tongue, other parts of reproductive organs very large, and then tiny little shoulders, tiny legs, and representative proportionately of how much of the brain is required in order to perceive different regions of the body in terms of touch. So he was great, and that was unarguable then about how we could start to map the brain in a more spatially resolved way with more information about the different features. And then we come to another great Oxford man, Charles Scott Sherrington. These are the beautiful stained glass pictures actually in King's College in Cambridge. We all take claim to Sherrington for the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine, both Oxford, UCL and Cambridge. And he was just extraordinary. Again, another one of these wonderful polymaths. And he noted that the brain was an extremely perfused organ. Now, I love Sherrington for two main reasons. One, he was really the person that put on the map the idea that the brain was mappable with blood flow based techniques, which is the techniques that has been the basis of many of our careers in the neuroimaging space. But he also worked on pain as well and nociception, and he did it all in the building that I was teaching in just the other day. This is not from his work, but this is just to give you a sense of how perfused your brain is. So if I took a person who had passed away and they donated their brain, and you put a cement through the vessels so that it filled all the arteries and the veins and the capillaries, and then you used another chemical to sort of dissolve away all the neurons and glial cells, so you're just left with the three-dimensional architecture of your perfusion system, your blood vessel system. This is what you're ending up with. It's extraordinary, isn't it? You can see the arteries here, the big ones, and you can see all these tiny little capillaries. You can see that at the grey matter, which is the sort of business end of the neurons, very densely packed, need lots of feeding, lots of oxygen, lots of glucose to feed those neurons. And then the white matter that's down here, which is largely the area where the bundles are sending the information around, you don't need so much perfusion because they're not doing the business end, they're just sending the information around. So he proposed this concept, which is illustrated on this graph here. So the only sort of graph I'm going to show you in terms of just a little bit of basic maths. I always am very careful not to terrify people with things like equations and stuff, but it's a very simple phenomenon because at that time of Sherrington, it was not understood. Now we know that the brain's where things happen, that when you do use a part of your brain to see or hear or smell or taste or feel or have an emotional experience or make a decision, lots of just extra blood goes to the brain, not regionally to that bit that's subserving that particular experience. And what he was able to show with exquisite, I think, brilliance and very basic tools was just a little strain gauge sitting on top of the skull, having taken a little hole out, and just measuring whether there was a global expansion of the brain, because lots of blood was going everywhere, or whether it was just regional to the bit that was subserving whatever the experiment was, movement, he was tickling a whisker barrel or seeing something, and he showed it was local. And he showed that the consumption of oxygen and glucose was linearly related to the delivery of blood. So there was this what we call hemodynamic or blood flow response when the brain works. But it's beautiful in that it's a nice relationship, but also it's local. It only goes for a bit. And that, of course, was locked away then, back in the sort of 1970s, 80s, as a concept that there's local delivery of blood when the brain is working in a particular way. And this is really key because it's the basis of why all of neuroimaging works in terms of blood flow based techniques, because it relies on the fact that you can map where the blood flow is changing because it's feeding a bit of the brain that's doing the job. And then you want to find out which bit of the brain is doing what, because that's what we need to understand. So we then have to make a tool that actually is going to let you image the brain. And this is where serendipity and science comes together. It's another great Oxford story. Martin Wood sadly passed away now. He worked in the physics department, and he came up with the first generation of what we call superconducting magnets. So at that point in time, you'd plug a magnet in, and you probably remember from school generating your own little electromagnets by putting electricity through a wire and moving it, and you can generate a magnetic component at right hands. Probably little bells are going off about the right hand rule now. Well, he came up with the concept of superconducting by keeping things really cool. It's like a big thermos flask. You've got liquid helium in there, and then you set it off, and then it can be self-propelling as long as you keep it cool. And that then opened up the idea and the concept and the ability that you could make really big magnets that were going to be very stable in terms of their magnetic field, big enough to put people in. So he started the whole physics of, these amazing magnets that opened the door for then what subsequently fell out, which was another Nobel Prize for Peter Mansfield, who worked in Nottingham in the physics department there. That was the whole birth of magnetic resonance imaging. And that's another whole lecture in its own right. So magnets were really key. It allowed an explosion of really MRI machines to occur worldwide after Mansfield sort of invented the whole concept of MRI. But the bit that I want to share with you is then the bit that you use these tools to actually do the mapping bit, the functional imaging. And this is just a wonderful, again, serendipity of biology. And this is where we come back to the wonderful crystallographers who tell us how things really work at that molecular level. It just so happens, I've told you that the brain is working, it needs to be fed, there's a local delivery of blood flow there. And of course, oxygen gets to that bit of the brain through the blood, and it's carried there through being bound to an iron atom on a big molecule called hemoglobin, because oxygen isn't soluble in water. So you've got this sort of workaround. So you've got the hemoglobin there, there's a beautiful X-ray crystallography structure of it, you've got the iron atom, and you can attach the oxygen molecule there, and that's how it delivers. Now, when oxygen is on that iron atom, the iron atom itself is basically what we call diamagnetic. So in the presence of a magnetic field, it doesn't really distort anything. But when it delivers its oxygen to feed that bit of the brain, it becomes what we call paramagnetic. Don't worry what that means. Just think of it as now a little bad piece of iron that's going to distort the magnetic field. So this was understood, and in biochemistry back in the 70s under George Rader's leadership in his team, they were playing with the idea that basic parameters that you would measure with magnetic resonance techniques, particularly in water, which is largely what you're imaging when you're imaging bits of the body, that you could change the parameters of these magnetic things that you're measuring if you shifted the oxygenation level of the blood. So they would just be playing around really, measuring things because it was really interesting. They could see that you could change a thing called the relaxation rate when the iron had become paramagnetic compared to when it was diamagnetic, and that was something that was very measurable. So we've got all these little things sort of coming together, and then this lab in Boston decided to put it all together and say, well, hold on a minute, we can now image the human brain with MRI, and it's imaging water. There are these experiments that Sherrington did back in the day that showed there's local delivery. There's this phenomenon that was discovered in biochemistry, which is you can see a change and a distortion in the magnetic field every time iron delivers its oxygen. Would it be possible that when you are imaging the human brain and you measure the signals, when the signal gets distorted because you've got this shift of local delivery of oxygen there and you've shifted it to lots of healthy diamagnetic iron as opposed to the paramagnetic, is that measurable? And that was the birth of functional imaging. and it worked like a dream, and the rest is history. So what basically you're doing, in a nutshell, with all that very, very brief explanation, is you do some sort of sensory stimulus. That's going to drive neural activity. So it could be you're lying in the scanner, you've got this flashing checkerboard, and you're seeing something. Now, the bit at the back of the brain is where the neurons are involved in allowing you to see. So they're working like mad. They need to be fed. So you have what we call neurovascular coupling, and lots of oxygenated blood arrives. The original first second or two is delivering and sucking the oxygen off the blood in that local region. So in fact, you're making the whole image worse because you've got all that bad distorting paramagnetic ion. But within a couple of seconds, this phenomenon overrides and brings all the good oxygenated blood there to keep feeding it. So it improves the local environment that you're imaging in, and you get a boost of signal just in the bit of the brain where that's happening. The rest of the brain stay in the same signal. So you take lots of pictures when you're looking at the flashing lights, lots of pictures when you're not. You subtract them from each other. All the bits of the brain that are not involved with that task will subtract out because the signal stays the same. And the only bit that will pop up will be the bit where you've got this shift to the good ion that's making the imaging signal a little bit better, and it boosts it by a couple of %, and you can measure it, and then you map it. And then you know, that happened there. And you can map it. And that's basically functional imaging in a nutshell. And the journey there from sort of not knowing anything about the brain all the way through to all these different discoveries. And hopefully you've got a better sense of just Oxford's journey on this and the contributions that have been made. And now we fast track to the world I live in, which is to have all these extraordinary ways that you can capture information about the human brain in a magnet, because in addition to just doing MRI, where you can measure the volume of the brain, you can measure other types of signals that will tell you about the white matter connections, and you can look at how they change with different disease. You can actually look at how they change even as an adult brain. You learn new things and you learn new skills. Until we have the tool to look at how white matter connections, we could measure them in vivo, we thought once you reach the adult brain, basically you just degenerate, was the going textbook model. And then we had all these tools and we suddenly realized, actually that's not true. Bust that myth. If you learn new tricks, you can see changes in the white matter connection of the wiring. Absolutely fantastically empowering and a positive message. So keep learning things, keep doing new skills. It keeps your brain wired up, it keeps it strong and healthy because we've got the tools to measure and map that. You can look at the way the brain is in conversation with with different parts of it, even at rest. You can see preferential wiring. You can look at chemistry of the brain. That's how I started out in biochem. And then you've got the functional imaging, which is the brain activity here, all based on that Sherrington observation, local delivery of blood, the ability to distort the magnetic field and then correct it, and then map that as a signal intensity difference. So the clever bit in experiments comes as how do you design an experiment with the sort of what we call on-off paradigm or more or less paradigm. And that's, of course, where the intellectual exercise becomes, as well as obviously then the analysis of the data. So that's all can be done in any bog standard MRI machine that you might have had the misfortune of having to go in. In top of having just MRIs, you can do all this. And pretty much, obviously in a research setting, most of these techniques are for research at this point, but more and more they're going into the clinical setting and being used as powerful additional adjunct measures to tell us information about the brain anatomy, physiology, neurochemistry, and how that's changing with a particular condition. There are other techniques that we are very fortunate in Oxford we have. We are a really powerhouse of neuroimaging in this university, and we've got all these other techniques called magnetoencephalography, electroencephalography. PET we haven't quite got yet for the brain. We've got it in other areas in oncology. And these are different techniques that allow you to look at the brain again in different sort of ways where you're measuring more the electrical activity. And just to sort of tell you again another part of the brain journey, from the Sherrington time to the Martin Wood time with the magnets and the George Rader times with the oxy-deoxyhemoglobin. Actually, George Rader, who is here, who was my supervisor, along with John Newsom-Davis, sadly passed away, and Alan Cowie, who also sadly passed away. So Alan was head of experimental psychology, and John was head of clinical neurology, and George was head of biochemistry. So these three professors decided to set up this first imaging centre in Oxford, building on the strengths we had in neuroscience, building on that great history we had in imaging and MR technologies. And that's me, very young there, at the groundbreaking with the the little shovel and we built this, and then very quickly we had to keep growing it 3 times over. So this is the current imaging centre at the moment. And of course, you're always trying to upgrade and get better scanners in, new scanners. 7 Tesla is the current state-of-the-art system that we have. So it's a beautiful machine. We're always, any talk I give, welcome to volunteer for any experiment. We can take names afterwards and contact details. These are the beautiful pictures you get. I don't know why physicists always put fruit in when they're testing the new scanner. It's got water and it's symmetrical. They love it. And so the physicists always image fruit. That's a beautiful, very expensive image of a pineapple. That costs several £1,000,000 just to get that. But you can see the quality of the brain pictures. I mean, it's just extraordinary. It's almost histological. And this is all in vivo. That's the quality you get at 7 Tesla. So moving on to pain then, for the last part of my talk, if that's all right. Pain's great. I love it. I've spent my life there. One of the hardest things for me to decide in terms of doing this job, and it did take a long time to be persuaded to apply, was because I knew I'd have to leave this, my scientific life behind. And it's been such a joy to work in this space, and the people I've had the great fortune of having in my team, of course, is always the best part of that job. But, you know, I am really loving being Vice-Chancellor, so I'm happy I did go for it and got the job, because it's an amazing job and I absolutely love it, more than I anticipated. And the teams are carrying on with the work, so that's great. Lots of wonderful people that are really doing brilliant work at the moment. But let me just give you a little taste of some of the things that my group has done over the years. So just some basics to orient you. Acute pain's good, actually. It is your warning system. It tells you something's wrong, and therefore you're driven to make a decision to do something about it. So it's a warning system. It's really important to have. And we know it's important because patients who have a condition called congenital insensitivity to pain often historically would die early teens because they would have horrific accidents, they wouldn't have the acute warning system, and they would therefore develop internal bleeding that would kill them, or sepsis, and they didn't have the trigger to tell them something's not right, I need to get help. Now, chronic pain is another whole story. This is the dark side of pain. This is basically not serving any purpose. It's just the system gone wrong. And indeed now, for the first time, it's been decided that 7 different conditions would be listed as diseases in their own right. So not just a symptom of the initiating thing that causes acute pain. There are still some that is just a chronic version of that, but some will have taken on a life form of their own, and therefore they need to be understood in their own right as a disease in its own right. And that paradigm shift has only just happened in the pain field. It's not still broadly prevalent in the medical space, and it's really important. It sounds subtle, it sounds blindingly obvious, to be honest, but it means that then you are targeting and trying to understand the chronic pain disease and the biology of that, not the thing that caused it. And I don't know why it took us actually so long to think of it in that different way, because when you look at symptoms that patients have in different chronic pain disorders, they're quite similar in certain overlapping conditions. So if you've got similar symptoms, there's a mechanism that's producing that symptom. And it doesn't matter whether you've got diabetes, or you've had maybe a shingles episode, or you've fallen off your bike and ripped your nerves, you've got multiple sclerosis. These are profoundly different things, and yet you might have similar symptoms, which means when you've mutated over to that chronic pain state with those symptoms, it's obviously become something different. It's not related to the initial condition. So that's why we think of it differently. And it's a huge problem. 1 in 5 of the adult population, more prevalent in the elderly and women. Sorry, looking at the demographic in the room. It costs a fortune. Treatment and management, people not going to work because of their chronic pain, $600 billion in the USA, a couple of €100 billion in Europe. And the suffering and the job loss, the comorbid anxiety, sleeplessness, etc. It's a huge toll in terms of the suffering and the burden, as well as obviously, you know, to society in the context of, again, costs. You've heard about the opioid crisis. I'm not going to say too much on this. We can go into that in question time. But I think what that has done is highlighted the enormity of the chronic pain problem. Why have we ended up in this state? Well, there's a whole set of reasons for that. And largely the deaths now due to street fentanyl and the chemists coming in and producing fentanyl that is just extraordinarily potent and toxic. And in my lectures, I show the students, here's a vial of heroin that will kill you. And it's like a little vial with about that much heroin. And here's a vial of fentanyl that will kill you as a couple of grains. And that's potentially laced in your cannabis and whatever. So just don't do drugs. And this is why you've got 134 young people dying every day in America because of the street chemists come in and they make these things potent once you've created an appetite for opioids, which is what's happened. So there's a whole I could do a whole lecture on just the opioid epidemic, but the point here is it has put a spotlight, and people are like, why are we in this mess? And you go back, it's like, because there's a lot of chronic pain about, and we don't have very good drugs to treat it, and most of the drugs don't work. And therefore the desperation of the patients and the physicians, they've turned to the opioids. In fact, that's going to make it worse long term, and you end up in this situation where you have an appetite for opioids in society, in come the street chemists, and it's a perfect cocktail. So there's good news stories there because people are sort of attacking and dealing with it. But I just wanted to mention that because it's so topical. We don't have the enormity of the problem here, but we still have a problem. And indeed, one of my dear colleagues is working on an opioid detox clinic up at the hospital there because people inadvertently will become addicted. So that does happen. So in terms of pain perception, where I've spent in using imaging, it's the sort of last step of all perception. So when I say the word perception, I mean the basic things that you experience. So if you think about it, in your head, you have most of the bits of organs that allow you to perceive the world. You have your eyes to see, you have your ears to hear, you have your nose to smell, tongue to taste, and then of course you've got your cutaneous or skin system across your body to interact and feel with the world. And that's perception. But perception is all built on what we call a 3 neuron order system. The first bit is transduction. It's how do you communicate and get the signals in from the world, whether it's light in your eyes, auditory sounds coming into your ears, touching something that's hot. So that's the transduction bit. And 2 brilliant scientists, David Julius and Arden Pataputan, got the Nobel Prize the other year for understanding the transduction bit of what we call nociception, which is the phrase coined by Sherrington right back in physiology here, where he was mucking about with acid and other things on his own arm and recording and realised there were nerves that only reacted to things that generally you would say ouch to, and then there were other nerves that didn't react to that. And so he realised there were special nerves in your body that reacted to things in the environment that hurt you. And if you think about the things in the environment that hurt you, they fall under 3 domains: thermal, noxious cold and heat; chemical, so that'd be a bee sting or a nettle sting; and then mechanical, so cutting yourself or a hammer. And so they've worked out all the machinery that gets those signals in. Then they get sent into the spinal cord and up to the brain. That's transmission. And that's a true picture of an X-ray of these patients who have congenital insensitivity to pain. You can see their legs are totally smashed. They feel no pain. So you can imagine they just jump off buildings. They would be used in circus tricks because they would leap off a building. They wouldn't be able to stand up, but they wouldn't be writhing in agony, and that was, they were used, with certain, of course then they died, because then you'd have a terrible, infection afterwards. So the transmission bit, and then that's actually proven to be quite helpful to work out why do they not transmit. Is that a druggable target? Because then you could stop the bad signals coming in chronic pain. And then the sort of final stage is the brain receives these signals and shuttles it to the right parts of the brain, and you have the experience of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, or feeling pain. And that's basically it. And then you decide, what does that feel like? And you go back out into the world and interact. Now, the challenge there, and this is why it's been a hard nut to crack, is that, one, pain is subjective. It always will be. You can't objectify a subjective experience, obviously. But what you can do is objectify or have objective information to help understand why is that person's experience perceived in a certain way. And it can help unravel and go under the bonnet of that subjective private experience, but you'll never objectify that. That gets into the realms of philosophy, and we don't go there. So what we can do is help understand, why is the patient's pain described in a certain way that seems to be at odds with what you are comfortable with as the observer they should be feeling, based on a very strong model that we've all grown up with all the cultural biases that hit us, that, well, they really shouldn't be in that much pain. They're obviously a bit of a moaner, or they're a bit neurotic, or they're making it up, etc., etc. And, we can all have our biases. This one here, very arthritic hand, we would expect that to be painful, yes? We would expect this hand not to be painful. You're probably comfortable if, one of your, friends said, actually, I don't have any pain whatsoever. You'd be, yeah, that's pretty stoical. They're tough. But you wouldn't be comfortable, I bet you, if a woman of my age said, I've got excruciating pain in my hand, and you looked at the X-ray and you saw that. You say, really? What's wrong with you? There's something else wrong with you. You're trying to make that up. Because we've got biases. And basically what I'm going to tell you is there's no way you can make a judgment call about what private pain experience somebody can have based on looking at what's going on in the periphery. In acute pain, it's sort of more easy, loads of injury, generally loads of pain. But even that, I spent 35 years. I can make pain pleasant. And I don't have to look at sadomasochists to do that. You can flip, you can make pain do what you want. It's a very malleable experience. So even in acute pain, you can make it highly what we call non-linear. And certainly in the chronic pain, when somebody's been in that state for months, years, the whole breakdown of their normal, social structure, losing their job, the impact it's had on their identity, they've just become consumed by this identity of pain. You can't possibly understand, looking at just the crude ways we look at the periphery, how much pain and suffering they're in. Because the journey up to the brain has got all these places which can massively influence ultimately how much arrives in the brain and which bits of the brain it goes to. So that mismatch between the injury and the perception, and that gap, is where I've spent most of my career trying to unravel and get over these biases so that we can give objective information that hopefully make the right decision about what to do. Because the way we measure pain is pretty crude. You distill all that suffering, all that loss into just these crude measures. 0 to 10, where's your pain? It's quick, it's cheap, it works-ish for acute, but doesn't capture, does it, all that suffering element? There are, of course, other questionnaires that will do that much better. You might infer behaviour, but you'll look at that and you'll all make your own judgment as to, based on your own pain experience, what you think that person should be doing. It's human nature, it's what we'll do. If you don't have that, you've got indirect physiology, if they're comatose or asleep. But none of these are very good. They're all indirect, they're all subjective. Either they're your subjective analysis or they're the person's trying to describe to you what they're feeling. So if we go back to Descartes, he also did this as well, which was very good. It was goodish. What he did is he said the brain is involved in pain, having split the mind, brain, body. So he did start to suggest it was up there, but he gave a very simple linear or one-to-one mapping. So what happens in terms of the foot in the fire is what's going to happen in the brain. It just is a simple one-to-one relationship. So more fire, more pain. And generally that is the case. But it's an oversimplification. And so what we know now is that if your mood is different, if you are attending or you're distracted, if your expectations are different, these will all powerfully influence the way those signals are received, and they will influence the way they're processed, and ergo they will change the perception. And these influences are more powerful, in my experience, than the injury itself. They are hugely important, and they're all generally in your noggin and in your brain. So you cannot, again, assume that there's a one-to-one mapping. It's a highly non-linear relationship, and that non-linearity is where we've spent most of our lives. So if you go into a situation where you are distracting somebody, so let's go to recent topical vaccines, having a jab, and you distract, which is a common trick, it works. Because actually you've got an incredible system in your brain that top down will just block the signal in the distraction, stops the signals coming up, doesn't hurt, moment it's over, baby screams because the signals are allowed in. And we've built this amazing system over, years and years of evolution to have these points from right at the start of injury, right in the spinal cord and up in the brain, where you can turn it up, you can turn it down, and then you can route it to all sorts of different parts. So if you're looking at somebody who's experiencing pain and they have anxiety and depression, it makes it worse. Again, if you attend, it'll make it worse. If you're distracted, it will make it better. And so the types of experiments we've done is take those intuitive concepts and then drill them down into really carefully controlled, boring experiments, and then use imaging to prove. So if you see this little pattern of activity, you can see the brain is responding, and generally it's a set of brain regions. Pain activates a lot of brain because it's so important to be aware of it and do something about it and make a decision about it. So even though it can be a simple stimulus, even just a paper cut opening up a letter, you will, if you think about it, you'll locate where it is immediately, you'll attend, you'll know it's a paper cut, not a thermal cut, you'll decide, oh, it's not that bad, I'll just carry on. And you do that in an instant without even thinking. That actually requires quite a lot of brain power. And within that, there's an element of ouch, it hurts. The ouch, it hurts bit, we still haven't really mapped. I have my suspicions where I think it sort of is as a network, but that's the really hard bit. All the rest of it is helping you contextualize the pain and decide what to do about it. Really important brain processing regions, but still the hunt for where the hurt is, or the hurt network is still, well, I think we sort of got good ideas where, but that's still an area for progress. So you get this huge area of the brain that's telling you to attend to it, it's in this location, it's of this quality, it's of this intensity, and do something about it. But if I make somebody to the same painful stimulus I'm giving them, distracted or attend, or I make them sad or I make them happy, I can change. Can you see this blob pattern change? We're not talking glamorous graphics here, so forgive me. But you can see it changes, and that's giving the same burn. So I take you up to the lab, burn you repeatedly, or electrocute you, or poke you. We got all the devices available to man. We've even got balloons that we've put in all sorts of orifices, blown them up. That hurts. That's not easy to recruit to those experiments, I can tell you. So you can do all those, give the same stimulus, but you can just change the context, you can change the mood, you can change the attentional load, you can change their expectations, and you can change the experience like that. It's so easy. So it's really, really easy to change the perception, because you've got this incredible capacity in your central nervous system, your spinal cord and your brain, to adapt and change. And you sort of think, well, why on earth have we got that? And my own hypothesis for that is that it's so important to make the right decision what to do about pain. Evolution has built us this incredible system that we fine-tune that can change it really dramatically. So in certain situations, the last thing you need to be distracted with is the pain, because something worse is going to happen. So you've got systems to just block it. In other situations, you need to be heightened so that you're really alert to it and you do something about it. So we've built over evolution all these extraordinary touch points across that whole three-order neuron system, where it can be turned up, down, and then when it gets into the brain, you've got an incredible amount of flexibility there. So hopefully already I can stop at this point. You cannot make a judgment call about the perception, which is the end stage, based on what you're seeing in terms of the physical injury. And the medical model we all love is I want to hear what the person feels based on what I can see, and I want to see lots of blood and damage, and then I trust them. Just doesn't work. It's just going to let you down every time. And that's the bit that still needs to be worked on. And I think imaging's been really powerful because it's so simple to see. And so for getting patients to get involved with the fact that the brain is a very powerful organ, it can make the pain worse, it can make it better. Therefore, embracing psychological interventions and thinking about ways to make you still have joy in your life and enjoy things and use things that will distract you, to show them the brain distracted from pain, lights off. You're attending to your pain, lights on. It's very simple to understand because we're very visual animals, and it's been a very powerful tool for helping, just demystify some things and get the brain a little bit more centered and change some of the biases and attitudes about, I don't want, the moment somebody says pain is in your brain, because that is where it emerges as a perception, then patients will feel you're not trusting them, you're thinking they're making it up, etc. And that's just an educative thing. So I found brain imaging has been very helpful because it's very complex to do and analyse, but the pictures themselves are beautifully simple, and it's very persuasive because of the way we are. So we've done loads of experiments where we've simulated going to the dentist and being freaked out and anxious, and we've shown that, again, to the same stimulus, just makes pain worse. And we've worked out where the little, what I call neural amplifier that anxiety works in. It's a very precise region of the brain, is your little amplifier. We're going to come back to that in a minute with nocebo effects. We can show that the brain becomes very much more active. If it's more orange and yellow, it means it's more active. There's more blood flow in there feeding it, so it's very much more active here than here. Why? Because they're depressed here. We made them sad whilst we electrocuted them, and we made them sad by playing them Prokofiev's Russia under the Mongolian yoke at half speed, whilst they read statements saying, my life is a failure, I have no friends, and they became very sad, and then we electrocuted them at that point. And then they listened to some nice Dvorak, and they read some neutral statements, and they were neutral in their mood, and then we electrocuted them the same amount, and surprise, surprise, they felt more pain when they were depressed or sad. It wasn't really going into a clinical depression, and that was, if you subtract these pictures from these, you have that much more brain activity to the same physical stimulus. This is just all acute and healthy students, just because we made them sad. I would have to electrocute them or burn them a lot more to drive the brain up. I don't have to do it because it's right up here. I can turn up the volume. So very powerful pictures. Again, very simple to understand. Why? Because sadness produces a dysregulation of your emotional regulatory system in your brain. So when something unpleasant like pain happens, you don't have the emotional control to put a lid on it and dampen it. So those signals are allowed access to other parts of the brain in a more significant way. So it just hurts more. And it physiologically hurts more. Of course, I believe in the physiology of the mind, but showing that something like depression actually will magnify the pain, and it's not just making them report the pain more negatively, which was what was assumed before, that they're just reporting everything in a more negative way. This is actually amplifying physiologically activity, and by having brain imaging, you can see it, and therefore we can stop having the conversations around not dealing with the depression or the anxiety, because that is a very important player, just as important as the injury. So we need biomarkers. I'm going to skip over this. We've done lots of work on the basics of what is chronic pain, because I'm conscious of the drink starting over there, and I've got quite a bit more to show you, if that's all right. You all right to go for a few more minutes? 10, 15 minutes probably? Yeah, okay. Is that all right, Jill? Yeah, that's all right, Jill. Jan. Right. The big area that we've worked on a lot in. So chronic pain is the big problem. Lots of major things go wrong. And again, lots of different work. I've just seen, in fact, one of my former students, and also Katie Vincent is here, who's a wonderful OBS and gynae consultant who did her doctorate with me and persuaded me to work on hormones and pain. I'm not showing any hormones and pain, Katie, I'm sorry, but do talk to her afterwards if you're interested in how hormones affect the female brain and the male brain, and how that interacts with pain. Good to see you here. So lots of things go on in chronic pain, and we've again used the imaging to try and unravel that and contribute new ways that we can think about treating it. One of the areas that we've really worked on is this old part of the brain called the brainstem. So it sits here, and it's one of my favourite areas, and we've worked a lot. And it's got these two cops in it, I call it, good cop and bad cop. And what we've realised is that this system, which has got this incredible capability in what we call a top-down manner to communicate to the spinal cord, in which the pain, the sort of signals are coming in from the bit of the body that's damaged, and it can talk down to them. The good cop will talk down to it and stop it. It just blocks it. It just shuts the gate. So nothing's allowed in. You don't feel pain. That's what's kicked into when the mother distracts the child with the teddy and the vaccine, right? Then there's this bad cop, and that bad cop will talk down in a facilitatory way and turn up the signal. So more goes in and it hurts more. And the recognition now is this balance between these two is really important in dictating maintenance and exacerbation of chronic pain, and resetting them is really important. So in chronic pain, too much bad cop, not enough good cop, and what you want to do is reshift it to that. And so we've done a lot of work to prove this point, that this is true, with lots of different studies and different patient groups. Looking at you all, I'm sure some of you had knees and hips replaced. Yes, I'm seeing some nods there. And generally, you know, the injuries in the periphery, fix the injury, pain's gone. But for 25-30% of patients a year later, they still actually have pain. I hope that's not the case for any of you here. And for those that do, it's because the operation and the joint replacement, they'd already gone a little bit central. There's a bit too much bad cop going on, and that was then going to confound and make the ability for just treating the peripheral bit not as successful as dealing with the resetting of the bad cop and good cop, which is why if you only take the joint out, give a new knee or a new hip, a year later they're still in moderate to strong pain. It's not worked, so you've got to deal with that pain. Again, same in diabetes. It's been really hard to know what the pain is in diabetes. I'm not saying that it's all brain causally generated, but it's a huge player in explaining what's been a mystery in painful legs patients with diabetes as to what's going on in the periphery, where's the problem. And we've shown that the more that the bad cop is ratcheted up, the more that explains the burning feet, the pins and needles, and the amount of pain that patients with diabetic peripheral neuropathy is. So we've been able to then take this as a biomarker, or a way of using it as a sort of assay, if you like. And again, that's a busy slide. The general point is we've done a lot. I'm distilling 30 years of work with applying developing the concepts, proving that this thing was really involved in this maintenance of chronic pain, showing that that can translate into different patient cohorts, and then using it with drug discovery as a marker to use as an assay for new drugs to be developed to help show that you can reset the good cop and the bad cop and get things back to normal again. So what we're also realising is that actually the fundamental balance even of the good cop and bad cop, all of you now have a certain set point. And remember, the brain's developing. That life journey that you've had is contributing to, as an adult brain, whether you just are sitting now, some of you in this state, even without pain, or some of you will be more in that state. And that will be predictive, and it will confer a vulnerability as to whether, if you do get diabetes, the likelihood of developing painful legs. If you do go in for a hip or joint replacement, the likelihood of it then not being so good, etc., etc. It's a hypothesis where we've got some preliminary good data, particularly in patients who've gone on to chemotherapy and haven't had pain, but the chemotherapy agents have effect of the nerves, and then some patients will develop pain with that and some won't. And surprise, surprise, the ones that develop pain with that are the ones that had too much bad cop ahead of going on to the chemotherapy. So again, showing about that vulnerability and that predictive element. Now, the good cop is great because that's what, again, you tap into in situations where you want to get over the finishing line, and you want, I'm going to do the Boston Marathon next month, and so I will be in that state. Think of me, April 15th, where you're just sort of, your goal is to finish and you'll endure the pain and you'll distract yourself. The classic example of this is placebo, which has this long and checkered history. Illustrated here is the Beecher experiment, Henry Beecher, that was first done to really prove that the placebo effect was real. And the reason they're called placebos are because these monks would sing these Latin chants called placebos at your funeral, but they were paid to come to your funeral. So that is why the word placebo has this concept of fakery and deception, because the mourners were not actually mourning for you. They were paid to turn up and pretend they were sad and sing these Latin chants. And so this deception is a real problem for the placebo effect, because until we've been able to use imaging to prove there is nothing special about placebo analgesia, it hijacks the good cop just in the same way as when you're distracted, it will hijack the good cop. It's physiological, it's powerful, it actually produces effects that's probably as good as any drug we've got, but we don't use it because the moment, weirdly, Beecher showed it actually significantly worked, we threw it out the window as unethical, can't do it. And it's been a really interesting journey that the world's gone on. It was the birth of the randomized control trial, lots of different repercussions, some of which were good, but some not good at all. So long history, if you want to, there's a whole little thing I've written on rethinking placebos. And the science is, I'm just going to whiz over these slides, it's unarguable. It just hijacks that good cop. Countless experiments, imaging experiments, different techniques, different tools, all proving it just hijacks that system. So why don't we use it? Well, you can't lie to the patient. It involves deception. Because what you're doing with a placebo is you're setting up an expectation of a certain outcome. The person is conditioned to learn to experience that outcome. Then you give them obviously the fake thing, the saline injection or the sugar pill, and you'll physiologically map that outcome. All we've been able to do now is prove that it just uses this system. But what you can do then is learn from that and say, okay, in an ethical, normal way of a patient-physician interaction, so Katie talking to her patients, you are actually setting expectations anyway, but then you actually give a drug or you give a treatment. So maybe what we could do is learn what we've learned from the placebo, which is the powerful ability for it to hijack these systems that are really old and ancient and great, and use them on top of actually giving the drug. So patients come in, they have a chat with the physician. Sadly, they'll remember 30% of what they've told them. They'll walk out the room. And your likelihood is you're going to remember if you're a pessimist, you're going to remember all the things that are going to go wrong with the side effects. And if you're an optimist, you'll think of all the things that the drug's going to make you better at. Two completely different sets of expectations, same drug. Does it affect the outcome? And the suspicion is, yes, it would affect the outcome, because I've just shown you've got the neural circuitry for expectations to completely change the physiology of your perceptual experience of pain relief or pain. And so we did an experiment where we simulated that in the scanner. So we had subjects come in, they lay in the scanner, we burnt them, we took their pain ratings and we were imaging their brain. Then we started an infusion of an opioid drug, but we just didn't tell them that we'd started it. So it's called a hidden injection. So we start the infusion, they don't know, they're just told to report, how does this pain feel now? They report, we image their brain. The anaesthetist then goes in the room, does the big act. I'm going to start the infusion now. I just want to check your blood pressure, make sure everything's fine. They've been on it for 15 minutes. They think, whoopee, I'm going to have that lovely drug that I really liked last week. It worked really well. And we take their pain ratings, image their brain. And then the really sneaky thing we did is to go in and pretend that we were stopping the infusion. So we're going to stop the infusion now. Sorry about that. It's going to hurt again. Just need to check everything's fine. But we didn't stop the infusion. We kept it going. So what actually happens in terms of the pain ratings is extraordinary. These are the pain ratings at the start, 65 out of 70. It hurts. That's strong pain. This is the true analgesic effect of that dose of, it was a remifentanil drug we gave. So it does have a good effect. So hidden injection, They don't know if we're turning the heat down. They don't know what we're doing. They're just reliably telling us the ratings. But what you can see is it's got a good analgesic effect, as it should. It's one of the most powerful acute analgesics in emergency medicine. This is the extra analgesia you get just by having positive expectation. Same dose, same thermal stimulus, same everything. It's double the actual raw pharmacodynamic effect of that drug. And we actually thought that when we pretended to stop the infusion, they would just go back and reverse this, but they actually went back to baseline. So negative expectation, nocebo, the anxiety with that was enough to override the drug and take the ratings right back to baseline. And I'm afraid that's your chronic pain patient. And if you don't know what you're doing in clinical trials, you throw that drug out, it's not working. Of course, with the imaging, we're able to sort of image what's going on and prove that the subjects didn't cotton on as to what we're up to. And so we were able to, again, use the imaging to verify that the brain did calm down and then it recovered. But unlike the behavioural report, the brain activity doesn't recover back to baseline because, of course, the brain's full of opioids suppressing neural activity. And that's where you get the mismatch between the objective imaging. Imaging never lies, I always say at this point, because it's telling you, oh, you got drug in the brain and the drug's actually doing something, it's suppressing activity. But the person's rating is up because they're anxious and they've got nocebo. So then you can analyse, well, what's driving that positive gain from here to here and what's driving the negative, and you can do analyses that can unmask that. And what we showed lovely was, again, you've got the frontal brain talking to the brainstem driving the good cop that's giving you that extra bonus analgesia. And then this little area that we discovered years ago was where anxiety is making pain worse. And that was the bit that turned on, like that neural amplifier of anxiety, because like, oh my God, the drug's going to stop now, it's going to hurt. That little blip's on, it turns the pain up, and that's what drove the ratings back up. So I'll probably just finish with this, Jan, because I'm conscious of time. We'll have to miss the consciousness stuff, but I can talk a question next time. I just want to finish with this one, because this led to then a really, really brave study that one of my wonderful colleagues, who we were doing all the orthopaedic work with, the hips and the knees, Andy Carr, I don't know if anybody knows Andy Carr, former head of Nuffield Department of Orthopaedics and Rheumatology and Musculoskeletal Sciences, NDORMS for short, absolutely brilliant clinical academic and wonderful surgeon. And he had, I mean, honestly, this guy's so brave because he had the nerve, after decades of doing a particular shoulder surgery, which is his speciality for pain, where they go in and they take this little bone spur off this joint. And he then said, you know what, I wonder if it's just placebo. Having worked with us and really got into the whole pain thing and the fact that you could image the brain, etc., etc. And the odd thing is that unlike drug discovery, which you cannot develop a drug unless you have a placebo-controlled arm, so you know that the drug is doing something over and above placebo, in surgery, you don't need a placebo-control arm. You just assume it works. So the surgeons will say, I'm going to do this. This is the mechanism. Go. And nobody checks. Now, that's fine. If you're taking a tumour out, I don't think I need to see a control arm for that. If you're fixing a bleeding vessel, don't need to see a control arm. But if you're doing a surgical a procedure where the outcome is a subjective outcome, like pain or pain relief, you had better put a placebo-controlled arm in. Otherwise, you don't know mechanistically what you're doing. And placebo's powerful, as I've just shown you. It's more powerful, in fact, than any drug we've got at the moment for pain. It works. It's brilliant. So he did this study. Oh my word, it took 10 years. The first battle was just getting it through ethics committee. The idea that you take patients in, they'd have a full GA, have an operation, but you wouldn't actually do anything. Nightmare. Then trying to get surgeons to sign up across the country, where this is one of the largest private medical practices. Not happy, in case we see what we might see and hypothesize we'd see. Anyway, it took 10 years, they did it, and it worked. And basically the results were published in Lancet. We did a subgroup imaging analysis, which actually we're still looking at, partly because the people have moved on that collected the data. So we do need to get around to that, Katie, and finish that analysis. So we've got imaging data to confirm, but the behavioural results are really interesting. So these are the three groups that came in. Now, when the scores go up, you think that might be more pain. I don't know why the surgeons always do this. It's back to front. So if it goes up, it means it's better. You've got three groups. One group actually had no treatment. So 6 months, 12 months later, they improved. But not as much as these two groups, that were the two groups that came into the hospital, had the full Monty works, but only one group actually had the surgery. And there was no difference between them. It's placebo. It's pure placebo. You can imagine. He became public enemy number one in the surgical field. Poor guy. And thankfully, this study has been repeated and confirmed in others. And then the group that I was involved with, I was just a collaborator on this study. They very much led it. They then subsequently were involved in doing review articles to, one, show how to do placebo surgery trials ethically, how to then start really taking on a lot of these surgeries for chronic pain where there is no evidence base that you're doing anything over and above placebo. So therefore you are exposing the patient to the risk of the anaesthetic, the operation, getting an infection, etc. And that seems to me an elaborate way to drive a placebo effect. There might be other ways you could do it. So we should at least go in eyes open that is what you're mounting with it. It's shocking, isn't it? So I've already mentioned about the risk factors. I wanted to share with you UK Biobank because this is another great story of Oxford. If you don't know, anybody know about UK Biobank? Oh, great. Oh, yes, it's Oxford, of course. It's very well versed. Okay, I'll skip over this slide. It's awesome. For those who don't know, builds on the brilliant historical excellence that Britain has in collecting cohorts and just collecting data and thinking that might be useful one day. And it's historically always shown to be that it is. So UK Biobank was launched, Rory Collins and the Nuffield Department of Public Health, absolutely awesome guy, really set this whole thing going. 500,000 people, you can see the age group. Lots of information being gathered about them genetically, their socioeconomic status, lifestyle, etc. And then we were very fortunate to persuade the Wellcome Trust and MRC to fund a sub-project which is take 100,000 of those 500,000 and do intensive imaging of their brains, hearts and livers. And then the lab that I used to run was the one involved in developing the brain sequence, collecting all the data, and then making it publicly available on these big platforms, the Big Data Institute. And it's just, to put it into context, most of the studies I've shown you, you're looking at subject groups to get that data of about 20 patients, 20 controls, and you can do good stuff with that. When you have 100,000 brains, oh my word, you can start to see things in the brain structurally and functionally, and you can relate it to things about lifestyle and genetics in a way that is just unimaginable. And I think it's going to be really explosive on a political level what we're going to show, because what you're going to show in this age group is just how important, again, as I mentioned at the very start, that life journey is on the sculpting and the shaping of your brain, and the disorders that then are manifest as a causal correlate of then lifestyle will start to become very evident. We're very fortunate that, again, the funding's been given to take a second time point 5 years later. So even in that cohort, in 5 years, sadly, many thousands of them will develop Alzheimer's, and you will have a time point where they were very early and then more progressed, or they'll develop Parkinson's, or they'll develop MS, all sorts of different things, and we'll be able to then analyse data and be able to be predictive of what subsequently might be a sort of causal mechanism that then we can use as a biomarker to assess treatments against, etc., etc. So this is a huge data set, and of course it will help with some of those hypotheses that I've postulated on vulnerability factors like the bad cop and the good cop being out of balance, for predictive of people who are then not even with diabetes yet, but become diabetic, get nerve injury, and then have pain in their legs. And we can start to test, well, I won't, but the team carrying on with all the work can test those hypotheses. Now, I was going to talk to you about general anesthetics, but it's 7 o'clock and we all need a drink. But I won't talk about that. It's been a real joy to do this work, and it's the only bit of science that I'm keeping going with in a way that we're spinning out a discovery that we found. And if I can just indulge on one slide, the problem with anaesthesia is we don't have a biomarker for consciousness, right? We don't even know what consciousness is. And so we trend, even though I put it in the title, we studiously avoid using the word consciousness. It's all about perceptual unawareness under anaesthesia. And Katie Warnaby, who's worked with me for years on this and is now leading and carrying on with the work, is absolutely fabulous. So all credit to her. And what we're basically trying to do is understand what happens in the brain when you go from an awake state, the dose of anaesthetic goes up, the person goes to sleep, initially they stop responding, eyes closed, and they stop reacting. And then at some magical point here, it's the sweet spot for the anaesthetist to say they're ready to go, and the knife goes in. And they're brilliant, the anaesthetists. They do all sorts of amazing things where they look at, vital signs, breathing rate, heart rate, They give a dose based on population, based on height, weight, sex and age. Well, I've spent 35 years looking at people's brains. Your brain has nothing to do with your height, weight, sex and age. Well, age, yes, but once you're an adult, not. And so you've got all these measures that are population-based. They're not individualised. They're not even looking at the brain. They're looking at every other organ. So it's like going to the cardiologist when you've got a heart problem. They look at your brain, they look at your big toe and your liver and tell you what's wrong with your heart. You'd be pretty suspicious. So, but they do a great job. Why? Probably because they just give so much anaesthetic, they're over-anaesthetised, just to make sure you don't move, you don't feel pain, and you don't hear anything. And that, wouldn't it be nice if we had a brain-based measure that was individualised, that you would titrate the dose to, that you were confident you would be perceptually unaware, you're not going to feel pain, and you're not going to hear anything, and you're good to go. And we have serendipity, I'm going to skip the slides, we have found that through probably some of the hardest experiments we've done. It needed combining EEG, you can see this cap, with functional imaging, giving anaesthetics inside a scanner, blah, blah, blah. And we have discovered a very basic, simple, beautiful piece of biology that couldn't be more simple, and it's dead easy to measure. We've now taken it from the basic science experiments all the way through to verification, all the way through to even getting my husband involved in developing an algorithm for me so that we could do it in real time, so that we could take it into the anaesthetic setting. We then have just finished a big clinical trial in New Zealand with a clinical colleague of 120 patients where we've shown we can do it with real surgical anaesthesia. That was a scary night, the first patient, because up until then we just did experimental pain and we didn't know whether actually doing it for real, taking the patients up to the dose, holding them there and then going in with a knife, would they wake up and leap off the bed, and we'd be in real trouble. Thankfully they didn't. We're now just setting up a second trial in Denmark. We have a patent that's awarded various different territories, and so we're now spinning out a company, we hope very soon, to take this further to the next step and use it as a very translational tool, which would be the first of its type, that would be a brain-based individualized measure for titrating under anaesthesia patients to, which generally will take them at a much lower dose. So recovery is quicker, benefits are quicker, less damage to the brain. You can hopefully see the repercussions. So that's, in a nutshell, the sort of consciousness bit. And then the most important thing is these slides here, all the amazing, wonderful people that I have had the good fortune of supervising in terms of my doctoral students, postdocs coming in, different clinical fellows coming to work with me. You really do generate these extraordinary families that you become very personally involved with in terms of their journeys and their development. Particularly, you can see there's lots of women in the team, and helping them navigate their next steps of their careers and combining family and all the rest of it. It's been that's the bit that, as a scientist, we love most. Of course, you always have the thrill of the discovery, but it's the people. It's always the people. It's the extraordinary, talented individuals that we have the good grace and fortune to have and bring here to Oxford and develop relationship with, and all thankfully thriving in their own now professorial jobs around the world and doing great work for pain. And I hope that, despite telling you a lot about the challenges of pain, with these people in charge, I'm very optimistic about the future and how we can definitely develop better therapies to help all those patients suffering. This is the group, again, I just want to point out Katie Warnaby. Oh, she's on this slide here. Where is she? This is Katie, who's leading all the anaesthesia work. So if ever you want another talk on that, you should get her in to do that. So thank you very much again for the honour of giving this talk. I hope that it's a small way that we can connect the very molecular imaging side of what Dorothy did to the sort of systems level side of imaging of the work that we are doing. I'll leave you with the picture of the team. And I hope you feel you've learnt a little bit about Oxford's role more broadly, historically, in this amazing journey about how we've sort of opened up the brain to see how it works and how it contributes to all these different conditions. So thank you again. Oh yeah, I can take questions. Yeah.
I think we can all agree that that was an absolute tour de force, covering both history and science and bringing together wonderful discoveries in Oxford. 20-something years ago when I worked for a university spin-out, some of my friends were going off to this crazy lady who was burning their hands. And I thought, who on earth would do that? Luckily, she was only recruiting men at that point, so I didn't even
That was just deliberate.
have that. Shall I do this or shall I not do this? Little did I know that it would go on to develop all these amazing things. I will stop there because she amazingly is going to take questions, and I know we want to get on with that. So is there anybody with a question they would like to ask?
Hello, Edmund. Yeah, sure. So the question is about the sensory and the affective. We tend to think of pain as having two dimensions. One is the sensory discriminatory. Where is it and what type of pain it is and how intense it is. So, the paper cut, it's here, it's a paper cut and it's a 4 out of 10. And then there's the affective, the sort of the hurt bit. I don't like it, I feel anxious about it, etc. So Edmund is asking these two different dimensions. Obviously in chronic pain, the affective bit does become dominant. And there are particular neural regions. I don't want to go too much into the anatomy, and you're absolutely right. Orbitofrontal, anterior, insular, amygdala, these become very dominant in those conditions. And different studies that have now longitudinally imaged chronic pain patients from early onset, 3 months, those that recover and those that don't, will track the increasing hijacking of those more affective systems as dominant in pain. Also the learning systems, learning to always expect that a certain movement's going to hurt you. So learnt behaviour becomes very dominant, and that's another treatment therapy as to how to unlearn, because it could be that even when you have stood up to go make the cup of tea, you expect your hips to hurt. Well, maybe the nerves didn't fire, but you're so used to it and expecting it, you will set off the networks in your brain in a prior Bayesian sort of way. So another therapy that Ben Seymour, who's one of our newest recruits in the pain space up the hill, is working a lot on using virtual reality to get people to behaviourally unlearn learnt behaviours that are putting them off movement, putting them off action, and dealing with what's a time lag between recovery and the brain catching up, because the brain takes a while to catch up with actually what might have fixed itself in the periphery. So yeah, it's a great question.
There was a question right in the front row.
Yeah.
Would you like to comment on acupuncture?
Oh, acupuncture. Would I like to comment on acupuncture? We've never done any acupuncture or hypnosis, but other colleagues of mine, particularly in the States, have done that. And again, the beauty of brain imaging is that it's been able to explain or provide objective evidence for some of these very ancient old phenomenon. And as a sort of just not simple anecdote, but the problem with acupuncture initially is they were metal needles and you couldn't put them in the scanner. So once then you were able to develop titanium needles that could then go in the scanner. Absolutely, acupuncture will produce a measurable attenuation of brain activity to pain, and that's unarguable. How it does it and why it does it is still not understood, but the data is the data. So there's something going on there. Hypnosis is really interesting because that's more going into the sort of anesthesia type states where you unlock different brain networks that normally are working together, and then what you do in hypnosis, and similar to some of the sort of more unusual drugs that people might want to take for recreation, is you unlock those from talking to each other, so it becomes all dislocated. So we've not done them, but there is work on that, and it produces profound effects on the pain. Absolutely. So I think, again, brain imaging's been good for, I'm trying to sell brain imaging. I don't mean to be sort of like a car salesperson, but it's been, because it's so simple to see and understand, and it's, applied to some of these ones that have been very much put in the bin of weird and wacky, the complementary alternative medicine sort of approaches. What it's done is provided legitimacy for some of these therapies that other medical cultures have shown for thousands of years are very effective. But because it always required the subjective report, they were not believed because of all the biases. And then you can just show, well, it's doing something. We might not understand why, but you can't argue anymore that it's not doing something. Same for some of the chronic pain disorders, like the functional pain disorders that oftentimes for patients have been just disbelieved. Katie works in, gynecological pain and, conditions like fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome. Women have had a really hard time having the medical profession believe that they had something wrong with them. And when you show a picture using, say, some of the neuroimaging techniques or some of the positron emission where you look at the chemistry of the brain, you show this is a very unwell brain. There is evidently something not right here, so you can't argue that the person is making it up. So it's been very good at, again, getting biases out the room so that patients are properly treated. I think particularly women, some of these conditions that predominantly affect women.
One more question.
One more question. lady at the back with the spots. Not personal.
I can take questions over wine and dinner. Yeah, you can come and ask me over wine. Yeah.
The mechanism of transfer of pain, where, for instance, the injury is at the hip, but the pain is felt at the knee.
Yeah, so there's two types of sort of referred pain. The classic one, would be where people have a referred, say, pain, to the left shoulder from cardiac or appendicitis. Actually, the most common one people have, which they always forget is referred pain, is brain freeze with ice cream, hitting the top of the roof and going up there. That's just a referred pain. And that's an old consequence of the way the body develops and the wiring of the cutaneous, the skin system, as it signals come in from different regions of the body into the spinal cord, is mapped onto a particular organ internally. And for whatever reason, the brain will always, it can't work out whether it's coming from the organ or the bit of the skin, it'll always refer it to the skin, which is why you get this referred pain to a part of the skin. In the context of other types of transferred pain that might not be those classic conditions, that's a slightly longer answer. So get me over wine and I'll explain about a concept called lateral inhibition and these other ways that signals get sculpted inside the spinal cord, and that's why it ends up, again, shifting to another area, because you expand what we call the receptive field, so it can be moved over. But it's a bit more complex to this audience.
Thank you.
One more thing to say.
One more thing to say. Say it.
Yes, sorry. As we said at the beginning, this lecture has always been part of the Oxford Women's Festival. For 21 years, Yasmin Robson has been organising all sorts of advertising, getting people here, doing absolutely brilliant work. She tells me she's stepping down this year, but I think we should all thank her for all the work she's done in promoting this lecture. Now we can go number 3.
And I didn't say congratulations to Pat, the honorary fellow, so congratulations, Pat.